I was a man of many words. Words were not merely tools to me, they were sanctuaries, temples I built in silence and then filled with meaning. From the moment I began to walk as a child, I was drawn to the rhythm of speech, the cadence of sacred texts, the fragrance of words uttered with intention. As I grew, so did my appetite for knowledge, for discourse, for mastery of language. I could recite the Quran from memory, argue legalities with scholars twice my age, interpret the hidden folds of Sufi metaphysics with ease. My father had been a man of learning, and I was expected to walk the same path, but I didn't just walk it. I ran, devoured it, made it mine. By the time I reached manhood, people referred to me not only as a scholar, but as a lighthouse of wisdom. I stood tall upon the shore of thought, sending out beams for others to navigate by. The halls I walked echoed with the sound of footsteps trailing after mine, students, seekers, scribes, all hoping for a drop from the fountain I had drawn from. I gave freely. My words flowed, unhurried but ceaseless. I spoke of justice, of divine mercy, of the trials of the soul and the hidden meanings of revelation. And they listened, eyes fixed on my lips, hearts thudding softly in their chests, soaking in every phrase. When I paused, they leaned closer. When I concluded, they bowed their heads with reverence. I was their guide, their teacher, their voice of truth. Yet, in the quiet spaces between my sentences, something else stirred. A silence that I could not name. At first, I dismissed it as the fatigue of responsibility. A scholar's weariness, perhaps, from carrying too many questions on his shoulders and offering too few of his own. But the ceiling grew. It was not exhaustion, it was dislocation. A subtle slipping away from myself, as if the more I spoke, the less I was heard by the one who mattered most, the witness within. The hollowing came gradually, like a well slowly drying out while the bucket continues to draw water. I began to feel like an actor reciting lines on a stage whose set was crumbling behind him. I could describe the beloved with metaphors that brought men to tears, but I no longer felt that deep throb of love in my own breast. I could lecture on the unity of all things, but inwardly I felt fragmented. There was no flaw in my delivery, my voice still held its usual resonance, my arguments remained sharp, but behind it all, a question began to whisper. What if this river of speech I have built is a wall rather than a bridge? What if, in teaching others to seek, I had forgotten to continue seeking myself? Late into the night, after my students had returned to their homes and the lamps in the madrasa had been extinguished, I would sit alone in the garden beneath a sky too immense for thought. The stars above me shimmered with secrets they refused to tell. And there, in the hush of the earth's breathing, I began to sense something else, something not born of reason or scripture. It wasn't a thought, or a memory, or even a feeling. It was a presence, faint and nameless. It waited. It did not urge, did not explain. It simply was. And the more I sat in its company, the more it began to grow. At first, I feared it. What was this void that opened inside me the moment my tongue fell silent? What was this unknown that rose from the soil of stillness? I had spent my life trying to bring the light of certainty to others. But now I was faced with something that could not be spoken of. Something that refused to be named. And in my soul, a new question bloomed. What if the greatest truths are not found in words, but in what lies beyond them? I began to listen, not with my ears, but with the ache in my chest, with the stillness of breath held between moments. And there, I heard it. A voice, but not like any voice I had ever known. It did not come from outside, and it used no tongue. It did not address me with syllables. It did not reason or instruct. It merely was. A vibration, a whisper in the marrow of my being. I could not tell if it came from the earth or from the sky, or from the space between heartbeats. The more I tried to grasp it, the further it retreated. But the more I surrendered, simply allowed myself to be with it, the clearer it became. It spoke of nothing. It offered no answers. But it brought with it a strange comfort, a sense of being held, watched, known. I began to understand. It had always been there. Beneath the din of my lectures. Beneath the applause, the accolades, the lines of students with their ink-stained fingers and hopeful questions. It had been waiting in the quiet moments I dismissed as empty. Waiting for me to finally stop speaking long enough to hear. I had lived so much of my life building a cathedral of words. But this voice, this voiceless voice, showed me that the divine is not trapped within the pages of books or the loops of logic. It is in the silence that breathes between verses, in the stillness that lives behind the eyes of a stranger, in the tender gaze of a mother, in the final breath of a dying man. It is the presence that watches, waits, and never forces itself into sound. I didn't yet know what to call it. Some might say it was God. Others might say the soul. But I knew this, it did not care for labels. It was real, it was vast, and it had begun to awaken me in a way that no sermon ever had. For all my life, I had been a man of many words. But now, I began to suspect that the truth I had always searched for dwelled in the spaces I had always overlooked. And I, Rumi, who had lived by the voice of language, had finally begun to hear the voice that didn't use words. He came into my life like the breath of a wind I hadn't known I'd been holding. Not with ceremony or caution, but with the kind of presence that does not announce itself yet changes everything it touches. Shams of Tabriz. That was the name he offered, though his essence defied the narrow vessel of letters. He was not dressed like a scholar, nor did he carry the posture of someone seeking approval or comfort. His clothes bore the dust of the road, his eyes the ache of 1,000 nights spent awake in prayer or wandering beneath the stars. He was no one, and yet something in me rose to meet him as though he were the very voice I had been waiting to hear. The unspoken companion of my silence. The first time I saw him, I was seated beneath the vaulted archways of the madrasa, surrounded by my usual circle of eager disciples, the midday light filtering through the lattice of stone, dust dancing like gold. I had been speaking on divine unity, a lecture that should have felt as familiar as breath, but even as the words flowed from me, I felt that now familiar echo of emptiness beneath them. A hollowness that the words could not fill, no matter how carefully they were strung. And then he stepped in, just stepped into the courtyard like he belonged to no place and every place at once. His shadow fell across the mosaic tiles as though time itself paused to witness his arrival. I remember the stillness he carried, not a forced composure, not the silence of restraint, but a deep-rooted quiet that seemed to radiate from within him. He did not rush forward. He did not bow. He looked directly at me, and in that look, I felt every illusion I had built about myself tremble. There was no disrespect in his gaze. Only complete presence. I had spent my life being revered, seen with admiration, with deference, even with envy. But no one had ever seen me like that. Not the man I appeared to be, but the one I was beneath the names, the knowledge, the public form. His eyes, dark as ink and alive with fire, read something in me I had not yet dared to read myself. He spoke. One question. Simple, piercing. Rumi, he said, who is greater, Muhammad the Prophet or Bayezid Bastami? The words echoed off the stone, and the courtyard fell so quiet that the rustling of birds overhead became thunder. My students stiffened. Some glanced at one another, confused or scandalized. Such a question was dangerous. Blasphemous, perhaps. And yet I felt no insult. Only the weight of a key being placed before me. I answered, slowly, thoughtfully, the Prophet, of course. For he said, we have not known you as you deserve to be known, whereas Bayezid declared, glory be to me. The Prophet's cup was infinitely deeper, yet remained humble. Bayezid was intoxicated with but a single sip. Shams smiled, not with smugness but with a kind of relief. As though he had been waiting years for someone to respond that way. Then, without another word, he sat beside me. As if he belonged there. As if he had always been meant to sit at that exact spot in that exact moment. Something strange happened then. An invisible veil dropped between me and the rest of the world. My students' presence, the books around me, even the architecture that I had so often admired, all of it faded into a kind of peripheral hum. All that existed, truly, was this man beside me and the vast silence that began to pulse between us. After that moment, we were almost inseparable. Not out of arrangement or obligation, but because the gravity between us was greater than either of us could explain. It was not friendship in the ordinary sense, nor was it mentorship. It was recognition, a meeting of two flames that had once danced in the same fire. And though we spoke, often deeply, and sometimes passionately, there was more spoken in our silences than in our words. He would come to me not with teachings but with presence. He would say things that were riddles but somehow felt like answers. Rumi, he once said as we watched ants build their tiny empires in the sand, God whispers in the spaces you fill with your own noise. Will you be quiet enough to hear? I found myself walking with him through Kanya's alleys at dawn, long before the town stirred. The world was different in those hours, less certain, more alive. He would stop and marvel at things I had always passed without a second glance. A cracked bowl filled with rainwater. The way the morning breeze bent the stalks of wheat. A street dog sleeping on the edge of a merchant's rug. Everything speaks, he said once. Everything. Even the stones have tongues. But no one listens. Everyone is too busy trying to be the voice. He never demanded I believe him. He never claimed to be right. But something in his words felt truer than anything I had studied. And yet it wasn't his teachings that changed me. It was the silence he carried. It was how he lived with mystery as though it were his native language. I, who had spent years shaping language like a sculptor chiseling stone, suddenly found myself forgetting how to speak. Not from fear or confusion, but from awe. I began to sense something in myself that had long been muffled. A current beneath the surface. A music too sacred for the ear. I found myself pausing in the middle of lectures, gazing off into space, feeling as though someone were trying to speak to me, not through speech, but through breath, through the trembling of leaves, through the ache that had no name. It all culminated one evening as we sat outside the city, the sun melting into the horizon, painting the sky with colors that made even silence weep. We said nothing for what felt like hours. The grass around us whispered with the wind. The last birds called their final songs before nightfall. And then, without turning, he said, "There is a voice that doesn't use words. Have you heard it yet?" My breast caught. The question was like the ringing of a great bell inside my ribs. I could not answer him, not with words. But tears welled in my eyes, and in that moment, I knew he had asked the one question I had needed my entire life. The question I had buried beneath layers of eloquence and learning. I did not sleep that night. I lay on my back, staring into the heavens, listening to a silence so full it felt louder than thunder. The voice he had spoken of, it had no pitch, no language. But it was there, whispering through my bones, stirring in my breath, cradling me in its invisible hands. It had been with me all along. But I had needed someone like Shams, wild, unpolished, burning with truth, to remind me how to listen. In that moment, I understood, this was no ordinary meeting. This was a divine collision. He was not just a teacher, nor a friend, nor a madman. He was the threshold. The one who would lead me not into more speech, but into the heart of silence. Into the fire where words are born, and where they are finally transcended. That night, sleep became a stranger to me, and I did not mourn its absence. I lay not in rest, but in a kind of sacred disquiet, my body motionless, my mind suspended like a bird mid-flight between two unseen currents. My hands lay folded across my chest as if in prayer, though no formal prayer escaped my lips. I did not utter the names of God, though every breath that passed through me seemed to call him anyway. Something vast had opened within me, something wordless and yet deeply alive, as though the universe itself had turned its face toward me in silence. I was aware of everything: the creak of the wooden beams above, the rustle of the wind through the curtains, the distant bark of a dog breaking the stillness of the city, and yet all of these sounds seemed like ripples on the surface of something far deeper, something without sound or form. The question Shams had asked me only hours before, "Have you heard it yet?" was not a question in the ordinary sense. It was a touch, a finger pressed to the center of my being, pointing inward. That simple sentence, delivered without fanfare, had unraveled me. For years, I had been teaching others how to seek truth, how to surrender to love, how to peel away the ego and find the divine spark within. But in truth, I had become so fluent in the language of the sacred that I had begun to mistake language for the sacred itself. My words had grown beautiful and clever, yes, but increasingly they had become like golden chains, ornate, admired, but binding. Now, lying in that dim, quiet room, I realized just how much of my life had been built upon the architecture of thought. And thought, while useful, is not the door, it is only the key. The door opens only when one stops trying to open it. The voice Shams had referred to, the one that did not use words, was not hidden behind some intellectual puzzle or the mastery of doctrine. It was here. It had always been here. Beneath the noise of my own mind. Beneath the scholar. Beneath the poet. Beneath even the seeker. It lived in the stillness between two thoughts. It lived in the exhale I never noticed. It lived in the silence I had always been so eager to fill. As I lay there, my thoughts became birds, circling and flapping and eventually settling. They came with their usual questions. Is this madness? Is this mystical delusion? Should you not return to the clarity of law and logic? But I no longer needed to chase or silence them. I simply watched them pass. Their voices grew faint, like distant conversations overheard in another room. And then, in their absence, I became aware of something else. Not a sound, but a presence. Not a presence like someone standing near, but a presence like a breath warming the inside of my chest, a warmth that did not burn but illuminated. I cannot say it was God. I cannot say it was not. It did not announce itself with thunder or light. It did not speak in Arabic or Persian or the sacred tongue of Scripture. And yet, I felt more addressed in that moment than in any sermon I had ever heard. It was not teaching me, it was being with me. It did not tell me what to believe. It allowed me to know, without proof or persuasion. I was not being shown a secret. I was becoming the space in which secrets are no longer necessary. I realized then that I had never truly listened before. I had heard lectures, verses, poems, voices, yes. But I had never listened with my whole self. I had never surrendered my understanding, my identity, my need to interpret. This voice, which spoke without speech, communicated through resonance. It rang within me like a tuning fork held against the soul. It told me nothing specific, yet in its presence, everything became clearer. It was not a guide, it was a mirror. It reflected what I had forgotten I carried inside me all along. And with this recognition came a softness, an overflowing tenderness, as though the part of me that had been waiting at the gates of the sacred was finally being invited in. The tears that came were not loud. They rolled silently down my cheeks, disappearing into the pillow beneath me. I was not weeping because I was sad or even overwhelmed. I was weeping because the truth had come, not with drama or instruction, but with love. Pure, wordless love. A love that did not demand devotion, but invited it. A love that had no object and no end. A love that had been patient through years of noise and distraction, waiting until I was quiet enough to receive it. Hours passed, though I lost all sense of time. The night wrapped around me like a mother's cloak, and I let myself be held. I did not need to move. I did not need to decide. I did not even need to understand. I simply was. And in that state, I understood more than I ever had. Not in the mind, but in the marrow. I saw the flaw in how I had worshipped the surface of things, praised the form and forgotten the silence that gives it meaning. I saw how often I had mistaken eloquence for insight, applause for truth, knowledge for wisdom. The voice undid those knots without condemnation. It showed me gently, as a friend would, what I had become, and what I still could be. By the time the first gray light of morning began to stretch across the floor, I felt as though I had returned from a pilgrimage that had taken me not across land, but across the landscape of my own being. The world looked different. Not because the world had changed, but because my gaze had. I heard the call to prayer not as a duty, but as an answer. A reply to the voice I now knew I carried within me. The same voice that had risen with the sun, risen with the birds, risen even in the heart of silence. I stood slowly. My legs trembled not with exhaustion, but with reverence. I did not rush to speak. There were no words I could offer that would not be too loud, too small, too crude for what I had witnessed in the quiet. I knew I could never again teach the way I once had. I could no longer pretend that truth came wrapped in phrases and verse. I would have to change. Not gradually, but wholly. From root to branch. That morning, I walked to meet Shams once more. I did not run. I did not carry questions. I went to him not as a teacher, not as a master of texts or a voice of spiritual authority. I went to him as a listener. As a flame newly sparked. I went to him as one who had finally heard, for the first time, the voice that speaks not with words but with presence. And I knew, no matter how far I would go, how many poems I would write, how many lives I would touch, this voice would stay with me, guiding me through the dark, not by sound, but by light. That walk back to my home under the vastening sky remains etched in me more deeply than any verse I have written. Each step felt different, no longer merely the motion of the body through space, but a sacred unfolding, a movement of the soul itself. The streets of Konya, which I had known intimately all my life, now appeared unfamiliar, as if cloaked in some veil that had only now been lifted. Even the buildings, the stones, the dim glow of lanterns flickering in windows, all of it pulsed with a stillness that did not belong to the silence of night, but to the deeper silence that underlies all things. I remember passing by a vendor who was closing his stall. He looked up and nodded at me as he folded a rough cloth over his unsold figs, and for the briefest moment, our eyes met. In that glance, I saw not just a man tired from the day's labor, but something shining behind his weariness, a presence, a light. I had seen this man countless times before. We had exchanged greetings, the kind of polite murmurs that people trade without truly offering themselves. But tonight, there was no veil. I did not see him with the eyes of position or role. I saw him as part of the great current I had only just begun to recognize. He, too, was being spoken through by that voiceless voice, even if he did not know it. Even if I hadn't known it until now. The trees lining the street, their branches reaching into the indigo sky, whispered to one another. The breeze passing through them was like breath. Everything breathed. Everything was part of this immense stillness, this speaking silence. And I, who had spent decades dressing myself in identity, in knowledge, in the finely stitched robe of reputation, now felt unclothed, but not exposed. I felt free. As though the more I forgot who I was supposed to be, the closer I came to what I truly was. When I entered my home, the hush followed me. The familiar walls seemed changed, as if they, too, had been listening and now waited for me to speak not from the lips but from the heart. My family greeted me gently, their voices muffled by my inward echo. I answered them with a soft smile, a touch of the hand, a kiss to my son's brow. I could not explain to them what had shifted within me. Not yet. They would not understand, not because they were not capable of it, but because some transformations arrive in silence and must first be lived before they are spoken. I went to the study, my place of books and scrolls and ink. I sat there for a long time, not reading, not writing, just watching the flicker of the candle as it danced in the draught. I had written thousands of words in this room. I had instructed, composed again. But now, none of those words could touch what I felt. And strangely, that did not frighten me. I no longer felt the need to define the world, or myself, through language. I began to see language not as a tool to capture the truth, but as a trail left by it. A trail that vanishes once the truth itself is finally met. Sham's words had struck something ancient in me, something buried beneath years of recitation, beneath the applause of students, beneath even my most sincere devotions. Words are the fingerprints of silence, he had said. But most people see only the prints and forget the hand. That phrase turned over in me like a smooth stone held in the palm of the soul. I saw then that all my learning had been like collecting the footprints of a beloved, hoping they would be enough to bring me to his embrace. But the footprints, however sacred, are not the presence. The poem is not the rose. The scripture is not the divine. They point, they shimmer, they sing, but the real encounter happens when all pointing ends, and one finally arrives. I let the candle burn itself low. I watched its wax melt slowly down the brass holder, forming uneven ridges, small silent rivers of surrender. And I thought, even the candle listens. It offers its body to the flame without resistance, and in doing so, it gives light. That was the truth of Shams. He was a man who had offered his entire self to the fire. And the light that shone from him was not his, it was the light of what he had let burn within him. It was the light of having nothing left to defend. No name to preserve. No knowledge to protect. Only the truth, living raw and wild through him. I rose before dawn, without needing to wake. My body, like the candle, responded not to habit but to invitation. I made my ablutions slowly, not with the rigor of law but with the tenderness of love. Each splash of water against my skin was a reminder, I was washing away more than dust. I was preparing myself to meet the world again, newly born. I prayed not with formula, but with breath. I no longer begged to be heard. I listened. I did not ask God for guidance. I offered myself to be guided. And in the silence that followed, I felt it again, that vast, soundless voice, like light pouring through a wall I could no longer see. Afterward, I sat on the rooftop. The stars were still visible, faintly clinging to the night's last breath. And then, slowly, the sky began to change. A violet blush at the edge of the earth. Then saffron, then gold. I watched the sun rise without metaphor. I did not reach for poetry. I did not say, this is like the awakening of the soul. I simply watched. And that, I realized, was prayer in its purest form. To witness without comparison. To be present without agenda. To let the moment speak, not through my mind, but through itself. That morning, I did not return to my lectures. I walked again to the edge of the city, where I knew I would find him. Shams. My friend. My mirror. My undoing. And as I approached, I felt no need to speak. I did not prepare questions, nor answers. I brought nothing but myself, the self I was beginning to find beneath everything I had ever been. He looked up as I arrived, and this time he did not smile. He simply looked, and in his gaze, I saw a welcome that required no words. I sat beside him. The sun climbed slowly behind us, casting long shadows in front. We sat without talking for a long time. Two men, one silence. And in that silence, the voice spoke again. Not to my ears. Not to my thoughts. To the space between them. To the space I now knew as the doorway to everything. And I listened. I truly listened. The days that followed after that profound awakening unfolded slowly, each one peeling back yet another layer of my existence, revealing parts of myself I had never dared to face. This unraveling was not turbulent, but subtle and deliberate, like the gentle unraveling of a fine silk thread from a tightly woven tapestry. I moved through the world as if under a new spell, seeing through eyes that no longer belonged only to Rumi the scholar, Rumi the poet, or even Rumi the spiritual teacher. Instead, I was something else, less certain, more open. Like a traveler who has lost the map but gained a deeper sense of direction, I found myself walking a path that was at once terrifying and exhilarating. My daily rituals persisted outwardly unchanged. I still taught my students, recited the sacred verses, and sat in the courts of Konya to dispense wisdom, but inside, the rhythm was different. A quiet revolution was underway in the chambers of my heart. The voice that does not use words, the voice Shams spoke of, had taken up residence within me, and it demanded nothing but my attention. It was patient, relentless, and utterly transformative. I began to understand that all the knowledge I had gathered, all the verses I had mastered, were but traces, shadows cast by that silent voice. And now that I had glimpsed the source, I could never be content with the shadows alone. Shams was a constant enigma in this transformation. Sometimes he appeared like a wild gust of wind, sweeping through my life with unpredictable intensity, scattering the dust of complacency from my soul. Other times, he was the calm eye of the storm, sitting quietly beside me with an uncanny stillness that was more felt than seen. He never preached, never lectured. His teachings were lived moments, gestures, questions that seemed simple but pierced the armor of my assumptions. One afternoon, as we walked barefoot through a patch of wildflowers blooming beside the city walls, he stopped abruptly and plucked a single bloom. "Rumi," he said softly, "do you see this flower?" I nodded, feeling its delicate petals between my fingers. It speaks without words. It offers its beauty and scent without explanation. And yet, it is not silent. It sings the song of existence. His words struck a chord deep within me. I realized I had spent so long searching for meaning in grand speeches, in the majestic cadences of poetry, that I had overlooked the language of simple being, the language of the flower, the wind, the flowing water. I had mistaken the eloquence of words for the eloquence of life itself. There were days when this newfound awareness overwhelmed me. The voice within, that silent presence, would grow so loud that the cacophony of the world seemed unbearable. I would retreat into my chambers, closing the heavy wooden doors behind me, shutting out all sound except the quiet pounding of my own heart. I did not pray in the traditional sense. I did not seek to fill the silence with ritual or recitation. Instead, I surrendered to the silence, allowing it to wash over me like a vast ocean. In those moments, grief often accompanied me. Grief for the man I had been, the man who had lived wrapped in knowledge but disconnected from the living truth beneath it. Grief for the years lost in the maze of words and the applause of crowds. Yet, within that grief was an aching joy. It was the paradox of spiritual birth, to be broken open, to be emptied, only to be filled anew with a light that defied description. I began to see that joy and sorrow were not opposites but two sides of the same sacred coin. To feel deeply, to embrace vulnerability, was to touch the very essence of the divine. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and bathed the city in a golden glow, Shams and I sat beside the canal that wound through Konya's outskirts. The water flowed steadily, whispering secrets in a language beyond words. Shams picked up a smooth stone from the bank and held it up between us. "What does this stone say to you?" he asked. I turned it over in my hands, feeling its cool weight and worn edges. "Nothing," I replied. "It is silent." He smiled, a spark in his eyes. "No, Rumi. It is not silent. You are simply too loud. The stone speaks in a voice older than words, if only you would listen." I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, allowing the world's noise to recede. Then, amid the stillness, I felt it, the resonance of the stone's silent song. It was not sound but presence, a steady heartbeat beneath the surface of existence. The stone had borne the passage of countless seasons, the touch of rain and sun, the footsteps of strangers, and through it all, it remained itself, whole, patient, eternal. That night, instead of returning to my home, I wandered with Shams through the quiet streets, our bare feet brushing the cold earth. The stars hung low, vast and luminous above us, and the silence between our footsteps grew pregnant with unspoken understanding. We sang songs that were not meant for performance but were the natural overflow of the stillness within us. Our voices rose and fell, carrying the silent voice into the night air, weaving it through the tapestry of darkness and light. Yet this path was not without its trials. There were nights when the silence felt like a vast emptiness threatening to swallow me whole. When the unraveling was too much, and I longed for the familiar safety of certainty and doctrine. But in those moments, Sham's unwavering gaze held me steady. "Keep listening," he would say, his voice gentle but firm. And so I listened, even when it hurt. Even when the voice seemed to falter or retreat. Because I had come to know that this voice was not outside me, nor separate. It was the very core of my being, the flame beneath the ashes. In listening, I found not only God but myself, or perhaps I realized there was never any separation. The silence had been trying to tell me this all along, that the divine and the self are intertwined, like the river and its reflection, inseparable and ever-changing. This truth did not need to be spoken, for it was the ground beneath all speech. And so I walked forward, step by step, deeper into the silence, into the presence, into the voice that does not use words, yet speaks more profoundly than any language ever could. The deeper I ventured into this silent realm, the more I became aware of how much of my existence had been shaped by the relentless pursuit of voices that spoke in words, words that promised understanding, clarity, and meaning. For so long, I had wandered through the vast desert of my own mind, chasing after these voices like a thirsty traveler searching for an oasis that might quench his thirst. But what I found instead were only mirages, flickering images that dissolved upon approach, leaving behind a growing hunger that no explanation or doctrine could satisfy. Now, that hunger itself was transforming. It was no longer a desperate craving to grasp or possess knowledge, but a surrender to the ineffable, a willingness to abide in mystery without resistance. This surrender was not a sign of weakness or defeat, rather, it was the bold and fierce courage to be utterly vulnerable. To tear down every fortress of certainty I had built, brick by brick, until only the raw, trembling heart remained, the heart that beats not to the rhythm of reason, but to the silent pulse of existence itself. I began to notice with startling clarity how much I had relied on language as a shield, a means to protect myself from the vast, frightening unknown. Poetry, scripture, scholarly debates, and theological discourses had given me an identity, a place within the world, a mantle of authority and respect. These were the tools with which I had carved a space in society, and yet, they also confined me within an invisible cage. The voice I now heard, the voice that does not rely on words, was like a wind that slipped through the bars of that cage, teasing, beckoning, reminding me that true freedom does not come from mastery or possession, but from surrender. To hear this voice, I had to let go of the familiar anchors that had once given me comfort and security. There were moments when this surrender felt like falling into a bottomless abyss. The silence pressed around me so heavily that it threatened to suffocate every last breath from my lungs. The world I had known seemed to dissolve, leaving me naked before the vast unknown. Yet, in the darkest depths of that abyss, a light would flicker, small and fragile, yet infinitely enduring. It was the light of presence, the light of being fully seen and accepted without judgment or expectation. I realized that to truly listen to this voice, I must become an empty vessel, open and willing to receive whatever came my way, whether joy, peace, doubt, fear, or despair. None of these experiences could be rejected or ignored. They were all part of the path, part of the unfolding. One afternoon, as the sun blazed high in the sky and the air shimmered with heat, I found myself beneath the generous shade of a fig tree. The world around me seemed to hold its breath, the scent of jasmine mingling with the earth, the gentle rustle of leaves stirred by a faint breeze. I closed my eyes, allowing the habitual noise of my mind to surface, plans, memories, anxieties, but instead of engaging, I simply observed them, like clouds drifting across the vast sky of awareness. And then, beyond those clouds, I perceived it again, the subtle, wordless voice. It was not a sound that could be heard with the ears, nor a message to be grasped by the intellect. It was a presence so profound and encompassing that it seemed to enfold the entire universe within a single breath. In that moment, all distinctions between self and other, past and future, disappeared, collapsing into an eternal now. Time lost its linearity, the boundaries dissolved. I became aware of a vast interconnectedness, an invisible web that wove together all things with threads of love and light. I understood then that this voice was never something outside myself to be found or attained. It had always been within me, hidden beneath layers of distraction, pride, and learned knowledge, beneath the ego's frantic desire to control and define. This was the voice of the soul, speaking in the pure language of silence, a language that cannot be reduced to syllables or letters but flows endlessly like a river, deep and inexhaustible. A tenderness arose within me, surprising and overwhelming. I felt not only compassion for myself but for all who lived deaf to this silent voice, caught in the endless clamor of words and distractions. How many spend their lives chasing shadows, mistaking noise for truth? How often do we forget to simply listen, to the breath that sustains us, to the heartbeat that anchors us, to the sacred spaces between thoughts where the deepest truths reside? I came to see that the path of listening is not a goal to be achieved but a lifelong commitment. There would be storms to endure, moments when the world's noise threatens to drown out the silence, when despair and confusion rise like turbulent seas. Yet, each time I returned to the stillness within, even if only for a brief instant, the voice was waiting, steady and patient, ready to guide me home. As twilight descended and the sky deepened into hues of violet and gold, I walked again to the sycamore tree where Shams awaited me. His eyes, reflecting the fading light, held the quiet depth of one who has heard the unspoken song of existence. We sat side by side in the encroaching darkness, two souls immersed in vast silence. And in that sacred stillness, the voice spoke once more, not through sound, but through a luminous presence that weaves all things together. I listened, and in that listening, I found the boundless freedom of simply being. The quietness that settled over my heart was no mere absence of sound. It became a living, breathing presence that accompanied me in every moment, unwavering in its patience and depth. As I journeyed ever deeper into the realms of silence and stillness, I discovered that listening is an art far subtler and more demanding than I had ever imagined. It was no longer enough simply to hear sounds or spoken words with my ears. I had to cultivate a listening that transcended the senses, a listening with the very core of my being, with the soul itself. This kind of listening required every fiber of my being to soften, to unclench, and to open wide, like a flower blooming slowly under the gentle caress of the sun. It was a discipline that surpassed all the lessons I had learned within the walls of my study or the rituals of my prayers. It was a surrender so complete that the act of listening became indistinguishable from the very act of being alive and awake. I recall vividly one afternoon when the sun filtered through the latticework of leaves overhead, casting dappled patches of light and shadow upon the earth beneath. I sat alone by the riverbank near our home, the water flowing steadily but softly, murmuring in a language without words. The world around me was alive with gentle sounds, the rustling grasses whispering in the breeze, the subtle murmur of the current as it wound its way through stones, the distant calls of birds returning to their nests in the fading light. Yet within this vibrant symphony of nature, there was a silence so profound that it seemed to hold all sound in delicate suspension. It was the silence between each note, the sacred space that gives music its meaning and power. Closing my eyes, I let myself dissolve into this silence, surrendering all the clutter of my thoughts to the flowing river. In that sacred stillness, the voice spoke again, not as a sound to be heard by the ears, but as a presence that filled the vast emptiness within me with gentle, unshakable power. It was as if the river itself was teaching me the art of listening, to flow without resistance, to embrace both movement and stillness, to be wholly present with whatever arises and passes. I realized that listening in this way was not a passive act, but a conscious yielding, a willing surrender to the endless unfolding mystery that life offers us each moment. It required humility of a profound sort, not the humility that shrinks and hides, but the humility that softens the heart and opens the soul, inviting all of life to enter. As I sat there, I became increasingly aware of how often I had mistaken noise for wisdom, how often I had valued words for their quantity rather than their truth. In the scholarly debates, in sermons, and in the crowds that gathered to hear me speak, I had measured success by how much I could say, by the certainty with which I conveyed my teachings. But now I saw how words often obscured rather than revealed, how they could build barriers as easily as bridges. The silent voice I had come to know was not contained within speech or scripture. It was the essence that breathes life into all expression, the unseen force that moves the stars and quickens the soul. Yet, this path was not without struggle. There were nights when the silence around and within me felt like an endless void, merciless and vast. The ego, that stubborn guardian of the old self, resisted fiercely. It clung desperately to the familiar comforts of certainty, control, and definition. I found myself wrestling with shadows of doubt and fear, questioning whether this journey into silence was a descent into oblivion or a true path of awakening. But whenever the darkness pressed close, the silent voice would return, not as a roar or a blaze, but as a quiet, persistent whisper that rekindled my courage. It spoke of trust, surrender, and the sacredness of not knowing. One evening, as stars began to scatter their distant light across the darkening sky, I sat with Shams beneath the great sycamore tree. The air was cool and fragrant, rich with the subtle sense of earth and blossom. Words felt inadequate, so we spoke little. Instead, we shared a silence so full and alive it seemed to pulse with divine life itself. In that silence, I felt the presence of the voice more clearly than ever, not as something outside of me, but as the very fabric of my being. It was in the steady beating of my heart, in the rise and fall of my breath, in the eternal pulse of the night itself. In that sacred communion, I came to understand that the journey toward this silent voice is not a search for something external, but an inward turning, a coming home to the deepest place within. It is a path that leads beyond the grasp of the mind, beyond the distractions of the world, into the depths where the soul dwells in its purest, most unadorned form. In that place, listening and being become one. No longer is there separation between speaker and listener, no need for words to bridge the divide. The silence itself is the bridge, the sacred space where all things meet and are known without judgment, without explanation. As I rose to leave that night, the weight of this realization settled gently within me. The voice that does not use words was no longer a mysterious enigma but a living, breathing reality, a guide and a friend. It called me to walk with humility and grace, to listen with an open heart, and to dwell forever in the presence of the ineffable. And so, step by step, breath by breath, I continue onward, not toward a distant destination, but deeper and deeper into the sacred silence that sings eternally within. There came a time when the voice that did not use words became not merely a faint whisper in moments of solitude, but the very foundation upon which my life rested, the invisible current flowing through every fiber of my being. It was no longer a distant enigma to be pursued, nor a secret hidden behind sacred texts. Instead, it became the pulse of life itself, a living presence coursing through the mundane and the miraculous alike. This silent voice was never separate from the world around me. Rather, it was woven into the fabric of every moment, every breath, every glance exchanged in passing. The more I opened my heart to it, the more I realized that the entire cosmos was speaking this language, a language beyond words, beyond sound, a language that touched the soul directly, resonating deep within in a way no spoken syllable ever could. I remember vividly one particular morning as I wandered through the bustling streets of Konya. The city was alive with its usual clamor, merchants hawking their wares, the laughter and cries of children darting between crowded stalls, the rich mingling scents of fresh bread, fragrant spices, and the dry dust of the road. It was a symphony of sound and motion, chaos and order entwined in a daily dance. Yet, amidst this vibrant noise, I found myself not caught up in the clamor of words but listening deeply to the spaces between them, the silences threaded subtly through the chaos. It was as if the city itself breathed a secret message in those silent spaces, a song without lyrics, a truth felt rather than heard. In that moment, it became clear to me that the silent voice is not confined to the stillness of solitude but pulses at the very heart of life's ceaseless movement, in the interplay of sound and silence, presence and absence. This insight transformed everything I thought I knew about listening and being. I no longer sought the silent voice only in quiet seclusion or in moments of prayer. Instead, I began to carry that voice within me as a companion through the busiest marketplaces, the narrowest alleys, and the quietest courtyards. The voice demanded no absence of sound or distraction. It required only presence, a vigilant, tender presence within my own heart. It was a presence that allowed me to witness the world without judgment or separation, to perceive the divine spark flickering in every human face, in every fleeting gesture of kindness or sorrow. It was a voice that spoke of unity beyond division, love beyond form, and truth that transcended the boundaries of language and doctrine. Yet this path was far from easy. There were days when the noise of the world rose like a tempest, overwhelming my senses and drowning out the subtle whisper of that silent voice. The political disputes, the religious fervor, the endless debates and proclamations filled the air so thickly that I feared the voice might be lost forever in the clamor. Doubt crept in like a shadow, whispering that perhaps the silence I sought was only emptiness, that the voice was a figment born of yearning rather than reality. But whenever I turned inward, closing my eyes and breathing deeply, the voice returned, not in words, but as a radiant presence that suffused the hollow spaces within me with light. It reminded me gently but insistently that silence is not the absence of sound or meaning, but the fullness of being. That the voice beyond words is the essence from which all sounds and meanings arise and to which they ultimately return. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky in breathtaking hues of rose, amber, and violet, I sat beside Shams beneath the vast canopy of stars. The air was cool and fragrant, heavy with the scent of blooming night flowers and rich earth. Around us, the world hushed in reverence to the coming night. Words felt utterly inadequate, so we spoke none. Instead, we shared a silence so dense, so charged with life, it seemed to pulse with the very heartbeat of creation itself. In that sacred silence, I felt the presence of the silent voice more vividly than ever, not as something separate or external, but as the very fabric of my own being. It was in the steady beating of my heart, in the rhythmic rise and fall of my breath, in the timeless pulse of the night that enfolded us. In this intimate communion, I came to understand more deeply than before that the journey toward this silent voice is not a quest for something distant or other, but an inward turning, a homecoming to the most hidden, most sacred place within ourselves. It is a path that transcends the intellect, the senses, and the shifting illusions of the world, leading us into the depths where the soul dwells in its purest, most unadorned form. There, listening and being merged into one. No longer is there separation between speaker and listener, no need for words to build a bridge across a divide. The silence itself is the bridge, the holy space where all things meet and are known in their truest essence, without judgment or explanation. As I rose to leave that night, the weight of this understanding settled gently yet irrevocably within me. The voice that does not use words was no longer a mystery or an abstraction, but a living, breathing reality, a steadfast guide and a dear friend. It called me to walk humbly, with grace and openness, to listen with a heart unguarded, and to dwell evermore in the presence of the ineffable. And so, step by step, breath by breath, I continue this sacred journey, not toward a distant destination or final revelation, but deeper and deeper into the boundless silence that sings eternally within. This silence is home. This silence is love. This silence is the voice without words, and it is the very essence of all that is. There came a moment so profound that it shifted the very ground beneath my feet, a moment when I understood that the silent voice, the voice that does not use words, was not merely a fleeting experience or an occasional glimpse of peace, but a full awakening, an unfolding of the soul's deepest truth. It was as if I had been wandering in a dense fog for years, lost among the familiar shapes and shadows of thought and belief, only to suddenly find the mist lifting and revealing an infinite landscape within, a vast, luminous expanse where light and silence intertwined. This inner landscape was not distant or separate from me. It was the innermost sanctuary of my being, the sacred and boundless space where all opposites dissolve, all contradictions harmonize, and the mysteries of existence converge into a single radiant presence. In this sanctuary, the silent voice spoke with a clarity so overwhelming, so pure, that words, the tools I had long trusted, felt clumsy, inadequate, and altogether too small. The language of that voice was beyond language, a pure communion of presence, a sacred dialogue between my finite heart and the infinite source from which all life flows. Dwelling in this awakening, I realized that the silent voice was not a possession to be captured or a prize to be won. It was not a fixed thing, but a living, flowing river of divine love and wisdom that moves eternally through the depths of being. It carried with it a patience so vast it could endure centuries, and a gentleness so soft it could soothe the most restless heart. This voice never commanded or demanded. It did not coerce, judge, or force. Instead, it invited with infinite kindness and grace. It beckoned me to lay down every armor I wore, the armor of fear, pride, and false certainty, and to surrender all the fragments of ego that sought to cage or define me. To listen to this voice was to enter a sacred dance of trust, a mysterious reciprocity between the finite and the infinite, where I was both humbled and exalted, broken and healed. I remember one golden afternoon as the sun poured its warm light over the gardens of Konya. I sat beneath the ancient olive tree, its rough bark a steady support against my back, the earth beneath me firm and grounding. Around me, life hummed quietly, the buzzing of bees gathering nectar, the gentle rustling of leaves stirred by a tender breeze, the distant murmur of voices in the marketplace weaving their endless tapestry of human stories. And yet, inside me was a stillness so profound it seemed to hold the entire cosmos in its embrace. Within that silence, the voice spoke, not in words, but in the subtle, sacred language of pure being. It whispered eternal truths that transcended time and space, revealing the delicate web of interconnectedness binding all life together, the sacred unity that lies beneath the veil of apparent diversity. I reflected deeply on the countless hours I had spent debating theology, composing poetry, and engaging with the learned scholars of my time. Though these endeavors held their own value, I saw now how they often kept me at arm's length from this living voice. They were stepping stones, necessary in one phase of the journey, yet insufficient to bring me fully home. True listening required a radical letting go, a loosening of the mind's tight grasp on certainty, on definition, on control. It demanded the humility of a child, open, curious, unguarded, willing to be shaped and reshaped by the mystery itself. The journey was not always smooth. There were times when the silent voice seemed faint, distant, even lost beneath the tumult of my own fears and doubts. In those moments, I clung to the memory of its presence, a beacon in the darkness, allowing its gentle light to guide me through the shadows. I learned that the voice often speaks clearest in the spaces between breaths, in the pauses where words dissolve and thoughts vanish into stillness. It is in these sacred intervals, these holy gaps, that the soul drinks deeply from the wellspring of truth, replenishing itself for the path ahead. One evening, as the sky ignited with the colors of sunset and the first stars began to pierce the twilight, I walked beside Shams through the quiet streets of Konya. The city was settling into its nightly rhythm, and the air was thick with the intoxicating scents of jasmine and distant hearth fires. We spoke little, for words felt pale and insufficient in the face of such sacredness. Instead, we shared a silence so rich, so full of life, that it seemed to pulse with the very essence of existence itself. In that shared stillness, I felt the silent voice enfolding us both, weaving an invisible tapestry of light and love that connected every heart, every soul, every breath to the eternal source. In that sacred moment, I understood that this voice is the ultimate truth, the voice beyond all division, beyond all conflict, beyond all illusion. It is both the origin and the destination, the Alpha and the Omega of all things. To listen to it is to be reborn, endlessly and freshly, to awaken from the deep sleep of separation and remember the oneness of all life. It is a call to live with boundless compassion, fearless courage, and a love so vast it knows no limits or conditions. And so I walk this path still, ever drawn and held by the silent voice that does not use words. It guides me beyond the veils of appearances, beyond the distractions of the world, into the sacred heart of the divine mystery. In its presence, I find a peace that surpasses all understanding, a joy that is steadfast and unshaken by the tides of circumstance, and a love that flows endlessly, like a river without source or end, carrying me gently, lovingly, home. As I stand at the threshold of this long and winding journey, I am struck by how deeply the voice without words has woven itself into the very fabric of my existence. It is no longer a distant whisper or a fleeting glimpse, but a presence so intimate and profound that it colors every thought, every breath, every step I take. This voice is not a message carried on the winds or an echo fading into silence. It is the living foundation beneath all things, the quiet center holding the entire universe together within me. It does not speak through language or sound, but through the depths of my being, through the silent currents flowing beneath the surface of my awareness, casting subtle ripples that touch every fiber of my soul. To live in harmony with this voice is to align oneself with the eternal flow of life itself, to move gracefully through the cycles of joy and sorrow, birth and death, certainty and doubt, always carried gently by its unseen hand. Through the years, I have come to understand that listening to this silent voice is not a goal to be attained or a prize to be won. It is a lifelong practice, an ongoing dance of presence and surrender. It demands a patience that goes beyond ordinary endurance, a steadfastness that remains unshaken even when the storms of life rage fierce and wild. There are countless moments when the noise of the world threatens to overwhelm me, when fear, confusion, and despair cloud my vision, and the familiar comforts of old beliefs beckon me to retreat into certainty and control. Yet, each time I find myself lost, I return, like a weary traveler drawn by an invisible thread, to the stillness within, to the sacred place where the silent voice whispers its gentle truths. This return is itself an act of devotion, a bowing before the great mystery that transcends all understanding, a sacred offering of the heart. In the quiet hours of dawn, when the world is soft and new, I often find myself sitting alone in contemplation. The air is cool, scented with the delicate fragrance of blooming flowers and the rich earth freshly kissed by rain. In these moments of solitude, the silent voice comes alive like a living pulse beneath the surface of all things. It speaks not through words, but through a language of presence that fills the spaces between thoughts and feelings. It reminds me of the unity that underlies all apparent division, that beneath the surface distinctions of race, faith, and creed, there beats a single heart, a shared soul. It calls me to compassion, urging me to see not enemies or strangers but fellow travelers, each carrying their own burdens and light along the winding path. It teaches me courage, the courage to face my own shadows without turning away, to embrace vulnerability as a doorway to deeper strength and wisdom. Though wordless, this voice is the source of all my words and poems, the wellspring from which my teachings flow. It is a silent teacher whose lessons transcend the intellect and reach directly into the heart. I have learned that it is not through clever arguments or learned discourse that one draws closest to truth, but through humble listening and open-hearted surrender. This voice is a mirror reflecting the divine spark in all things, a gentle guide leading me back to the sacred wholeness that has never truly been lost. As twilight descends and darkness wraps the world in its quiet embrace, I feel the voice grow ever more tender and near. It cradles my soul in its vastness, whispering the truth that life is a fleeting gift, a delicate dance between presence and absence, light and shadow, silence and sound. It calls me to live fully, to love without reservation, and to walk the path of humility and grace. In heeding this call, I find a freedom unlike any other, the freedom not of escape or detachment but of being fully alive, fully awake, fully present to the sacred mystery unfolding in every moment. This journey is never solitary. The silent voice binds me to all who listen, all who seek, all who yearn for the light beyond words. It is the thread that weaves together the tapestry of humanity, linking hearts across time and space in a shared embrace of love and understanding. Through this voice, I glimpse the eternal dance of creation, the endless weaving of beginnings and endings, the unfolding of life's vast mystery in every breath and heartbeat. So I continue onward, guided always by the silent voice that does not rely on words. It is my compass when the path grows dark, my light when the way seems lost. In its embrace, I find the courage to face the unknown, the peace to rest in uncertainty, and the love to embrace all that is, both within and beyond myself. Through this endless listening, I discover the deepest truth whispered beneath the noise, that we are not isolated beings wandering alone through the wilderness of existence, but reflections of one eternal source, forever held, forever loved, forever singing in the silent song of the universe.